Prior to the expiration of Japan's signature on the Washington Naval Treaty in December of 1936, the Naval General Staff was already exploring the possibility of expanding the fleet in several replenishment programs, and in these programs, 10 fleet carriers were envisioned to be added to the fleet by the mid-1940s. These carriers were to fall under unrestricted designs, and of the designs proposed, only 2 would actually see a unit constructed, 2 to the Shokaku class, and 1 to the follow-up Taiho. Taiho is quite possibly one of the most known aircraft carriers from the Second World War, due to its disastrous last few hours, but the development of the ship was very important to the Imperial Navy, and in many respects, the ship was seen as a failure. In order to understand why Taiho was designed as it was, we need to look at its developmental history, which began in 1936 when the ship was first conceived. However, official designs were not submitted until autumn of 1937. The basic outline for the ship's design was a vessel of roughly 34,000 tons standard displacement, an overall length of 250 meters, an overall width of 28 meters, and a top speed of 34.5 knots with a maximum range of 10,000 nautical miles at 18 knots. This propulsion system would have to be identical to the 160,000 shaft horsepower units placed on the Shokaku class. Project W02's designs would see a vessel that effectively looked like the Shokaku, however, there were minor improvements. By 1938, Japan would begin producing the Type 98 dual-purpose guns, which would replace the Type 89s seen on the Shokaku, as the Type 98 was superior in practically every respect. The ship's funnel system was altered. Rather than having a funnel curved down towards the water, the funnel would still project from the upper hangar, but then it would curve upright. The funnel design being proposed here was left over from the G8 design, which was one of Soryu's earliest designs, and the reason that this was not used initially on Soryu is because it was thought that the funnels curving down would shoot the smoke into the water and would thus keep the flight deck clear. However, when the ship was moving at high speeds, the smoke would rise and could cover the aft end of the flight deck, which hampered with landing operations, and there were anti-aircraft gun positions after the funnels, so the gunners in those positions were effectively being gassed by their own ship. In order to address the issues seen on the ships with the funnels curving down, the anti-aircraft guns aft of the funnels would receive protective gas shields, and there would be a water system installed that would spray on the smoke, though this would turn it into hot steam, and would thus still tamper with the AA gunners. Project W02 would be renamed W102, and it was officially accepted on the 8th of December 1938, though development would idle out for roughly a year. In December of 1939, design teams were sent back to the project, and Taiho's development would kick off. But the completed carrier resembled nothing of what was initially accepted in 1938, as the Japanese learned from war experiences in both the Atlantic and their own failures in the Pacific. During the development of the Yamato class, the Japanese investigated the bulbous bow, and of course, the Shokaku would be the first ship in the Imperial Navy to mount such a piece, and the same bulbous bow design would be applied to the Taiho. However, aerodynamics were not investigated in depth on the Shokaku's design, but for Taiho, the Japanese looked at the Royal Navy's aircraft carriers and took note of the Hurricane bow. The Hurricane bow's addition also had the benefit of increasing the length of the flight deck at the forward end of the ship, because initially the flight deck's forward edge was to be set back as seen on the Shokaku, but in the completed design it would overhang the bow. Another funnel design was tested on the Hio as well. This incorporated the funnel projecting from the flight deck, but rather than going up straight as initially proposed for the Taiho, it was angled outward at 26 degrees, and thus this was seen as adequate for keeping the flight deck clear of smoke and not gassing the anti-aircraft gunners on the after starboard side. With the funnel projecting from the flight deck, the island was connected to it, and a few platforms would wrap around the inboard side of the funnel. This gave the benefit of increasing the already excellent 360-degree field view from this position. Due to the increased size of the island, it was seen as necessary to create a bulge in the starboard side of the hull for the island to sit in, so no width of the flight deck was being lost at any point of its length. The addition of the hurricane bow and the bulge for the island would increase the dimensions of the ship. It would now be 260 meters long and 29 meters at its widest. Even with the increased dimensions of the ship, the Japanese only managed to mount 6 coaxial Type 98 10cm high-angle guns and 17 triple-mount Type 96 2.5cm anti-aircraft guns. This anti-aircraft complement was looked down upon when compared to the Shokaku because there was loss in barrel count, and thus the follow-up design for the Taiho would actually extend the length of the ship even further so that 2 more coaxial Type 98s could be installed. The lacking anti-aircraft barrel count is one of the primary reasons cited as to why Taiho would be the sole ship of its design constructed. Even with these alterations having been incorporated, they were still not the largest alterations the Japanese would come up with. At some point, they deemed it necessary to incorporate an armored flight deck. Japan's approach to armoring the flight deck was not creating an armored box that encased the upper hangar level, as could be seen on British aircraft carriers, but rather the Japanese were solely interested in protecting the largest area of the flight deck and not the hangars. The armored section of the flight deck would be encased between the forward and after elevators, meaning that it covered about 150 meters of the ship's overall length, and the box only extended to roughly 20 meters of the flight deck's width, where the flight deck at its widest point was 29 meters. The reason the Japanese did not incorporate the armored flight deck across the entire length of the flight deck is because this would have made the ship highly unstable, and they deemed the central portions of the flight deck the highest probability of being hit. Of course, placing a gigantic piece of armor on top of the ship annihilated its stability calculations and made it top-heavy, and in order to counter this, the Japanese removed an entire deck from the lower sections of the ship, which meant Taiho was not as tall as the Shokaku. The removal of a deck decreased Taiho's habitability when compared to the Shokaku's, even though upon completion, Taiho had roughly 100 more crew members than the 2 Shokakus. This decrease in habitability may have impacted the next decision to altering the design, and this was the functionality of the aircraft carrier. It was no longer intended to be a frontline carrier like Shokaku and Zuikaku, but rather a support aircraft carrier, which this role is most commonly associated with the incomplete Shinano. Taiho's air group would only consist of roughly 60 aircraft, including spares, even though the ship was larger than the Shokaku, and it's been rumored that Taiho was capable of carrying up to 84 aircraft as well, but the additional space was used to carry additional avgas, bombs, and torpedoes, nearly twice the load that the Shokaku was capable of, so in the event Shokaku and Zuikaku needed supplies, Taiho had them. Of course, following the Battle of Midway, the risk of fires was seen as very real, and the water suppression systems did not cut it. So the Japanese reworked the fire suppression system. They kept the water systems, but in the hangar decks they would install 2 pipes, one running down port and one starboard, that would spray foam on fires, whereas from the lower hangar down, the ship would have carbon dioxide pipes installed, so in the event the avgas lines began leaking, or the avgas tanks themselves began leaking, carbon dioxide could be released into the ship, and this theoretically would kill the vapors, thus minimizing the risk of a major detonation. Taiho was the first new build completed with this fire suppression system installed. However, Shokaku was the first aircraft carrier to have it installed in the post-Midway environment. With all of these alterations having been implemented, the Taiho's displacement was increased significantly to 37,000 tons. So this meant that, when compared to the other fleet carriers in the Navy, Taiho sat very low in the water, and this was also shown by the fact that the elevator wells were at the waterline, with the lower hangar's floor being just above the waterline. The significant increases of mass in the upper levels of the ship and the deletion of an entire deck in the lower portions were the contributing factors to Taiho riding so low in the water. However, the biggest downside to the displacement increase was there was a drop in speed. Rather than going 34.5 knots like the Shokaku and Zuikaku, Taiho could only manage 33.25 knots. Luckily, the propulsion system still managed to give the ship an operational range of 10,000 nautical miles at 18 knots, like the two Shokakus. As for the rest of the ship, it was left largely based off of the Shokaku, which, if you want to know more about Shokaku's development, I have already made a video on that topic, and I will link that in the comments section below. As for Taiho, it was officially laid down on the 10th of July, 1941, launched on the 7th of April, 1943, and finally commissioned on the 7th of March, 1944, only to be sunk a few months later. With that having been said, that is all I have to say on the development of Taiho for today. So, if you have enjoyed this video, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.